October 17th, 1942, Northern Stalingrad, 06:43 hours. The morning air carried the usual smell of burning, iron, cordite, and ash. It was a smell the soldiers of the 62nd Soviet Army had long since stopped noticing. It had become, like the rubble and the cold and the constant distant percussion of artillery, simply the atmosphere of Stalingrad, a condition of existence, not an event. Private Alexei Dobrovolsky was moving fast. He had been tasked with carrying orders forward from Captain Semyon Voronov's command post, a cramped, half-collapsed basement on the western edge of the Red October factory complex, to the forward rifle platoons positioned approximately 300 meters ahead. It was a route he had taken before. He knew where to move low, where to run, and where to stop completely. He did not make it. At 06:43 hours, a single shot rang out from the northwest, a crisp, flat crack that cut through the ambient noise of the sector. Dobrovolsky dropped without a sound. The men closest to him froze instinctively, then pulled back into cover. No one returned fire. No one saw where the shot had come from. At first, it was dismissed. Single casualties were common in Stalingrad. The city had become a place where death arrived without warning or reason, where a man could survive 6 months of combat and die crossing a courtyard he had crossed 100 times before. It was brutal arithmetic, and every soldier in the 62nd Army had long ago made peace with it, or tried to. But within the next 40 minutes, 2 more men fell under nearly identical circumstances. Corporal Pyotr Fedorov at 07:02 hours struck while repositioning along the wall of the stamping shop. Senior Private Ivan Malko at 07:19 hours hit while attempting to reach a wounded soldier pinned down in the open. Both shots came without warning. Both men were moving through routes that had previously been considered relatively safe. Same type of movement, same exposure, same result. By 07:30, the pattern was becoming harder to ignore, and by 08:00, movement across the entire sector had slowed to a halt. It wasn't just the accuracy that concerned command, it was the consistency. What would unfold over the next 8 hours would become one of the most unusual and precisely documented sniper engagements in the entire Battle of Stalingrad, a confrontation not merely of weapons, but of intelligence, patience, and psychological control. And at its center, improbably, was not a counter-sniper team, not a coordinated tactical response, but a single rifleman sent in alone. To understand why that decision was made and why it worked, you first need to understand the world in which it happened. By the autumn of 1942, Stalingrad had ceased to function as a conventional battlefield in any meaningful sense. The Wehrmacht's Army Group B had pushed into the city beginning in late August, and what had followed was not the swift urban seizure the German planners had anticipated, but a slow, grinding destruction of the city, of conventional tactics, and of the men who had to fight within what remained. The industrial district of northern Stalingrad, encompassing the Berikady gun factory, the Krasny Oktyabr steelworks, and the Dzerzhinsky tractor plant, had become a landscape unlike anything soldiers on either side had been trained to navigate. Buildings that had once stretched 4 and 5 stories above street level now existed as skeletal frameworks of twisted steel and fractured concrete. Floors had collapsed into one another. Walls had blown outward, creating open spaces that offered no obvious cover, but felt no less dangerous for it. The geometry of the pre-war city had been replaced by an entirely new geometry, one defined not by streets and structures, but by sightlines, debris fields, and the accumulation of tactical experience written in blood. In this environment, conventional infantry tactics, the movement of units in coordinated lines, the use of cover fire and advancing sections became almost impossible to execute at scale. The terrain fragmented combat into isolated engagements. A squad might hold a stairwell for days. A platoon might contest a single factory floor for a week. Communication between positions, already difficult, became genuinely precarious, because maintaining it required men to move, and movement was where casualties happened. Into this fragmented landscape, the sniper became something more than a tactical asset. The sniper became a form of governance over space. A well-positioned marksman in Stalingrad could effectively deny access to an entire corridor, forcing opposing units to either expose themselves or remain stationary. A coordinated group of snipers could shut down movement across entire sections of the front, degrading enemy logistics, severing communication lines, and steadily eroding the cohesion of opposing forces. Both Soviet and German commands understood this, and by late 1942, both sides had begun deploying dedicated sniper units with increasing tactical sophistication. The Germans, specifically elements of the 305th Infantry Division and the 24th Panzer Division, which held portions of the northern industrial sector, had been refining their approach since the beginning of September. Their tactics had evolved beyond the deployment of individual marksmen. They were now operating sniper teams in overlapping, mutually supporting configurations, using the ruins of the factory buildings as ready-made observation platforms and firing positions. Soviet records from this period describe a growing sense of unease among frontline units about the nature of German sniper activity. The casualties were not being inflicted during active firefights. They were happening between engagements, during the movement of runners, the rotation of personnel, the resupply of forward positions. The Germans were not targeting soldiers in combat. They were targeting the infrastructure of coordination itself. That distinction matters, because it meant that the standard Soviet response, return fire, suppress, advance, was not the right tool for the problem. But that realization had not yet arrived. Not completely. Not yet. By 8:30 on October 17th, Captain Semyon Voronov had received reports of 6 confirmed casualties in his sector within the span of 2 hours. All 6 had occurred during routine movement. None had occurred during active engagement. Voronov, a veteran of the city fighting since September, recognized immediately that this was not random. He requested additional information from his forward observers and began piecing together what he could from fragmentary reports. The picture that emerged was troubling, not for its clarity, but for its lack of it. The shots were coming from multiple directions, northwest, north, and northeast at minimum. Distances varied. Some appeared close, perhaps 150 to 200 meters. Others seemed farther, possibly 400 meters or beyond. The timing between shots was inconsistent, ranging from as little as 90 seconds to as long as 12 minutes. At first glance, this inconsistency seemed to argue against coordinated action. A coherent sniper team operating on a defined plan might be expected to show more regularity. But that assumption, Voronov would later acknowledge, was precisely the mistake the German unit had anticipated. The irregularity was not a sign of disorganization, it was the plan. German sniper doctrine by 1942, particularly as practiced by units with significant urban combat experience on the Eastern Front, had begun incorporating what military historians would later describe as rhythmic disruption, the deliberate variation of timing, position, and engagement angle in order to prevent opposing forces from accurately mapping the threat. A predictable sniper could be located and neutralized. An unpredictable one could not. The unit operating in Voronov's sector had taken this concept further than most. According to post-war German records and the accounts of surviving soldiers from the 305th Infantry Division, the team deployed on October 17th consisted of 11 men, a formation that was unusually large for a sniper unit. Standard German doctrine called for sniper pairs or, at most, small teams of 3 or 4. 11 men operating as a single coordinated unit represented something closer to a sniper platoon than a conventional team. They had been positioned before dawn, moving into their initial locations under cover of darkness sometime between 04 and 5:30 hours. Each man occupied a pre-designated position within the ruins of the barricade factory complex, positions that had been selected not merely for their individual fields of fire, but for the way in which those fields of fire overlapped and complemented one another. The result was a zone of controlled lethality. Any point within a roughly 400-meter corridor could be engaged by at least 2 members of the team simultaneously. More importantly, the team had established a rotation system. After each shot, the firing sniper would shift position, not randomly, but to a pre-designated secondary location that had been identified during the pre-dawn reconnaissance. This rotation ensured that Soviet attempts to pinpoint firing positions based on muzzle flash or sound would consistently produce outdated information. And it was working. By 9 hours, Voronov's entire forward sector had effectively been immobilized. Runners could not move. Wounded men could not be evacuated. Ammunition resupply had stopped. The forward rifle platoons were holding their positions, but without communication or coordination, they were simply waiting. And in Stalingrad in October 1942, waiting was its own form of attrition. Command needed a solution. What they chose surprised almost everyone. At approximately 9:45 a.m., a message was transmitted from the headquarters of the 138th Rifle Division to Captain Voronov's command post. The message authorized a response to the sniper threat in the northern sector, but specified an approach that Voronov and his officers found, by their own later admission, unexpected. No counter-sniper team would be deployed, no artillery would be called in, no coordinated infantry assault would be organized to clear the factory ruins. Instead, a single man, Senior Sergeant Dmitry Kovlyagin, a rifleman attached to the 344th Rifle Regiment, would enter the sector alone, equipped with his standard-issue Mosin Nagant Model 1891/30 rifle, and conduct a reconnaissance and, if conditions permitted, an active engagement. The reasoning behind this decision has been debated by military historians for decades. Some have argued that it reflected resource constraints, that in the chaos of mid-October 1942, a dedicated counter-sniper team simply was not available on short notice. Others have suggested that the decision was more calculated than it appeared, that command recognized correctly that deploying a large counterforce into a sector that was not yet understood would simply produce more casualties without resolving the underlying problem. The truth, based on available documentation, appears to be a combination of both. What is clear is that Kovlyagin was chosen deliberately. He had been operating in Stalingrad since early September and had accumulated significant experience in the specific demands of the factory district. He was not a designated sniper, he did not carry a scoped rifle or possess formal sniper training, but he had developed a reputation among officers in his regiment for what they described in the language of the period as an unusual capacity for patience and spatial reasoning. He did not panic under fire. He observed before he acted, and crucially, he had a documented ability to move through urban terrain without drawing attention. Those qualities, command calculated, were more valuable than a scope. Kovlyagin received his orders at 10:05 hours. He was given a rough map of the sector, a brief summary of the casualty locations and approximate times, and a single instruction: understand what is happening before you engage. He was told not to attempt heroics. He was told to survive. He moved out alone at 10:22 hours. The sector he entered was, by any measure, a hostile environment. The ruins of the Barricadi factory extended across roughly 2 city blocks, the interior transformed by months of bombardment into a series of interconnected chambers, collapsed galleries, and open debris fields. Visibility varied from as little as 4 meters in some sections to nearly 300 meters in others, where entire walls had been blown away, leaving open lines of sight that could be covered quickly or crossed at fatal cost. Kovlyagin did not move quickly. He moved carefully, pausing at each transition point, observing before he committed to a new position. He used the rubble as it had been used before him, not as a path, but as a series of deliberate choices, each one designed to minimize exposure while maximizing observation. He was not trying to find the snipers, not yet. He was trying to understand the space they had chosen. In his post-action report, filed on October 19th, Kovlyagin described his first 30 minutes in the sector in language that reveals beneath its practical brevity a remarkable degree of tactical intelligence. He wrote that the first thing he noticed was not where the shots were coming from, but where they were not coming from. There were positions in the debris field that should, by any conventional assessment, have been engaged and were not. Open ground that offered clear lines of movement remained, as far as he could tell, unobserved. That absence, he wrote, was the first clue. The snipers were not covering everything. They were covering specific things. By 1100 hours, Kovlyagin had moved approximately 140 meters into the sector and had not fired a single shot. He had, however, Observed 3. 2 shots had come from the northwest. From an elevated position, he triangulated to somewhere within the collapsed upper galleries of the stamping shop. 1 had come from almost directly north, at a distance he estimated at 300 meters or more. What struck him was not the locations themselves, but the interval between the shots and the events that preceded them. In each case, the shot had come within seconds of a visible movement, a Soviet soldier attempting to cross from one covered position to another. There had been no delay, no hesitation. The response had been immediate, which told him something critical. The men who were firing were not searching for targets. They already knew where the targets would be. That meant they understood Soviet movement patterns in the sector. They had either observed those patterns over time, or they had been briefed on them. In either case, it meant that the problem was not simply one of accurate shooting. It was one of predictability. The Soviet soldiers in the sector were moving in ways that could be anticipated, and the German team had mapped those patterns and positioned accordingly. That realization changed Kovlagin's approach fundamentally. He stopped using the routes that logic suggested. He began moving instead through positions that offered no obvious tactical advantage, gaps in the debris that seemed too narrow, angles that appeared too exposed, transitions that a soldier following conventional cover and move doctrine would never choose. He was, in effect, trying to become unreadable, to move in ways that the German team's internal map did not account for. For a long while, it seemed to be working. At 11:34, he reached a position from which he had a partial view of the collapsed stamping shop gallery, a vantage point he had identified as potentially significant based on the angle of the 2 northwestern shots. What he saw confirmed his hypothesis, though not in the way he expected. The position was occupied. He could see the outline of a man against a fractured concrete pillar, but the man was not in a firing stance. He was watching, observing the open ground to the southeast with the focused stillness of someone who was waiting for something specific. Kovlagin did not fire. The target was partially concealed. The distance was approximately 180 meters, manageable but not ideal without a scope. More importantly, he recognized that firing at this moment would betray his own position, which he had not yet established as safe. He needed more information before he could engage with any confidence of not being immediately suppressed. He continued observing, and what he saw over the next 20 minutes confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The German unit was operating on a rotation. The man in the stamping shop gallery moved, not randomly, but deliberately, shifting to a secondary position approximately 15 meters to the left. Shortly afterward, another man appeared in the original position. The field of coverage remained constant. The occupant changed. This was the system. Continuous coverage, rotating personnel, no fixed positions to target. Any attempt to suppress a location would be engaging a position that had already been vacated. To break it, he would need to catch the rotation mid-cycle. At 12:10 hours, Kovlagin encountered the first deliberate attempt to provoke him. A piece of cloth, dark fabric that at distance might be mistaken for a helmet, was moved briefly across an open gap in the factory wall to the north. It appeared and disappeared within 2 seconds. It was precisely the kind of movement that an alert rifleman operating on elevated adrenaline and actively searching for targets might react to instinctively. Kovlagin recognized it for what it was. He had seen similar techniques used by Soviet snipers in the factory district, the deliberate presentation of a decoy target designed to provoke a shot, reveal a position, and allow a countershot within seconds. The German team had incorporated the same tactic, and it was well executed. The timing, the movement quality, the positioning relative to the nearest covered approach, all of it was designed to look real. That assumption would have cost him his life. He remained still. He did not fire. He counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3, up to 20, waiting to see what followed. At approximately 15 seconds after the decoy, a shot rang out from the north, striking a section of concrete wall 12 meters to his left. Not close, but not random either. The shot had been placed in a location that suggested the shooter was working from an imprecise but directionally accurate read on Kovlagin's general position. They knew approximately where he was. That was alarming, but it was also informative. It told him that his movement through the sector, careful as it had not been entirely invisible. Someone had tracked him or deduced his likely route. And the response to the decoy, a shot that came from north, not northwest, told him that the northern position was not the same as the stamping shop position. These were different men, different locations, coordinating in real time. He needed to move, and he needed to do so without being predictable. The next 40 minutes represented the most psychologically demanding phase of Kovlyagin's engagement. He had moved to a new position, a low crawl through a debris-filled channel between two collapsed exterior walls, emerging into a partially sheltered chamber within the western face of the main factory building. From here, he had limited but usable sightlines to both the stamping shop gallery and a portion of the northern wall. He waited, and he watched. He began timing the rotation, not with a watch, he had none, but with the internal rhythm that experienced soldiers develop in sustained observation, a slow, disciplined counting, a calibrated sense of interval built from practice and necessity. The rotation in the stamping shop appeared to occur approximately 14 to 18 minutes. The northern position seemed to rotate more frequently, perhaps every 8 to 10 minutes, suggesting either a higher level of alertness or a smaller area of coverage that required less sustained observation. At 12:52 hours, he observed a critical moment. As the rotation occurred in the stamping shop, the occupant shifting from the primary position to the secondary, there was a window of approximately 11 seconds during which both positions were in transition. The primary position was vacated. The secondary position was not yet fully occupied. For those 11 seconds, neither man had a clean line of coverage on the sector below. 11 seconds. That was the gap. Kovlyagin did not act immediately. He observed the rotation 2 more times, at approximately 13:06 and 13:22 hours, to confirm the pattern and establish whether the 11-second window was consistent or variable. It was consistent. The timing varied by 1 or 2 seconds, but the gap existed reliably, and its location within the rotation cycle was predictable once you knew what to look for. He also, during this period, began to develop a clearer picture of the overall team disposition. Based on the shot angles he had recorded, the movement he had observed, and the timing of the various engagements throughout the morning, he estimated the presence of at least 4 distinct positions in his immediate area: the stamping shop gallery, the northern wall position, a third position somewhere to the northeast that had fired only twice and remained largely silent, and a fourth, the most dangerous, that he had not yet been able to locate. That fourth position concerned him. It had not fired since the response to the decoy at 12:10 hours. In a coordinated team, sustained silence from one element typically meant one of 2 things. Either the position had been shifted and he had lost track of it, or it was being held in reserve, a suppression asset, to be used in the event that the team's other positions were threatened. He could not engage without accounting for all 4, and he had not yet found the 4th. At 13:15, a second decoy appeared, this time from the northeastern sector, a different technique, not cloth, but sound, a brief, sharp metallic clang that might plausibly have been a weapon striking debris. The sound was designed to draw observation toward the northeast, and it might have succeeded, except that Kovlyagin, by this point, was no longer reacting to individual stimuli. He was watching the system as a whole. When the decoy sounded and he turned his attention carefully, slowly toward the northeast, he caught movement in his peripheral vision from the west. A slight shift in shadow at a distance of perhaps 220 meters within a gap in the factory's western exterior wall, a position he had noted earlier but dismissed as structurally implausible for a firing platform. He had been wrong about that. The 4th position was in the western wall, and it was moving, the occupant rotating slightly, adjusting posture in the way that a man does when he has been still for a long time and anticipates becoming active soon. The decoy to the northeast had not been designed to draw Kovlyagin's fire. It had been designed to make him look away from the west at the moment the western position prepared to engage. That realization was the turning point, not because it gave him an advantage, but because it told him the team knew he was still there and was now actively trying to remove him. At 13:41 hours, Kovliagin fired his first shot of the day. He had been in the sector for more than 3 hours. He had observed 11 separate engagements by the German team. He had identified 4 firing positions, mapped 2 rotations, survived 1 decoy attempt, and narrowly avoided a 4th position ambush. He had moved 7 times, never predictably. And now, finally, he had a moment. A genuine moment, not a baited one, in which the stamping shop gallery position was mid-rotation. The western position was momentarily oriented away from his location, and the northern position had just completed a shot and would require at least a minute to reposition. He engaged the stamping shop position at a distance of 160 meters. The shot was clean. The man in transition between positions did not complete the movement. The effect on the broader German team was immediate, though not what a conventional tactician might have predicted. There was no sudden disorganization, no panic. The remaining team members, disciplined professionals with significant combat experience, went immediately to their contingency protocols. The 2 active positions oriented toward Kovliagin's firing location, and within 30 seconds, 2 shots had been fired at the section of wall from which his muzzle flash had been briefly visible. Both shots struck where he had been. He was no longer there. He had moved immediately after firing, a single rolling shift to the left, behind a fallen concrete column that he had identified as a secondary position 40 minutes earlier. He was now at a distance of approximately 12 meters from his firing point, with a different angle on the sector, and was already observing. The German team's response to his shot told him something important. The northeastern position had not moved. It had fired neither during the engagement nor in the immediate aftermath. That either meant it had been repositioned outside his field of observation, possible, or it had been left without an occupant. A possibility he had not fully considered was that the 11-man team, after hours of operation in the sector, had begun to experience its own attrition. Not from enemy fire, but from the physical demands of sustained stillness in cold, damaged terrain. Men rotate because they must, and in a rotation system operating over 8 hours, some rotations inevitably produce gaps. The northeastern position, he suspected, was currently empty. At 14:02 hours, he fired his second shot, this time at the western wall position, which had shifted in response to his first engagement and was now exposed at a slightly different angle than before. The shot was taken at 230 meters, at the edge of reliable accuracy for an unscoped rifle under field conditions. He fired twice, a practice he had developed based on the understanding that the first shot would almost certainly cause the target to move, and the second, fired within 1 second, had a reasonable chance of catching that movement. The western position went silent. By 14:10, the dynamic in the sector had shifted fundamentally. What had been an 11-man system operating with coordinated confidence was now at minimum a 9-man system that had lost 2 positions and was aware that an active threat was operating inside its coverage zone, a threat it could not precisely locate. The remaining German snipers made a decision that, in retrospect, was understandable but fatal to their effectiveness. They consolidated. Rather than maintaining their dispersed configuration, which required movement and exposed individuals to risk, they drew their remaining coverage toward the 2 strongest positions, reducing their field of coverage but increasing mutual protection. It was a rational response to an unfamiliar threat, but it was also a response that Kovliagin, watching from his new position, could observe and interpret. Consolidation is visible, dispersion is not. Between 14:10 and 14:35 hours, Kovliagin executed 3 additional engagements. 2 were successful. 1, a shot taken against a partially concealed target at 310 meters, missed, striking debris 2 meters wide of the intended position. He noted this in his post-action report with characteristic directness. Shot missed, distance excessive for conditions, position adjusted. By 14:35, movement in the sector had changed. The precise, systematic coverage that had paralyzed the Soviet position since morning was breaking apart. Positions were shifting more frequently, more erratically. The rotation system, which depended on confidence in coverage, was degrading. Men who should have been still were moving, and men who should have been moving were staying in place. The rhythm that had made the system function was gone. By approximately 1450 hours on October 17, 1942, sniper activity in Voronov's sector had declined to a level that permitted cautious movement. At 1510, a runner successfully completed a route that had been impassable since 07 that morning. At 1530, Soviet command confirmed that supply movement had resumed along the main corridor through the factory district. Communication between forward positions, broken since mid-morning, was restored. The engagement had lasted approximately 8 hours from the first casualty to the restoration of movement. Kovlyagin remained in the sector until 1620, observing and conducting 2 final engagements against positions he had not been able to reach earlier. He exited the sector with 4 confirmed kills and 2 probable kills, engagements in which he was confident he had hit his target but could not confirm due to the position's concealment. The German sniper team that had operated in the sector was not entirely neutralized. Post-war analysis of German unit records from the 305th Infantry Division suggests that between 4 and 6 members of the original 11-man team withdrew from the sector sometime between 1430 and 16 hours. Of the remaining 5 to 7, the documentary record is less clear, a reflection of the general chaos of unit record-keeping in the final weeks of Stalingrad's most intense fighting. Soviet casualties in the sector between 6:43 and approximately 14 hours totaled 11 confirmed dead and 7 wounded, a significant toll for a single morning in a single sector. Among the dead were 3 officers and 2 runners, precisely the categories of personnel whose loss most severely degraded unit coordination. Kovlyagin suffered no wounds. He expended 31 rounds over the course of his engagement. 31 rounds, 8 hours, 11 men neutralized. Those numbers are striking in their efficiency, but the number that matters most is not among the casualties or the ammunition expenditure. It is the duration. 8 hours in which an entire sector of the Stalingrad front had been frozen by 11 men, and 6 hours in which a single rifleman, without a scope, without support, without any formal counter-sniper training, systematically identified, analyzed, and dismantled the system that was doing it. That duration is the real story, because it tells you something important about what kind of warfare Stalingrad had become and what kind of soldier it required. The engagement on October 17, 1942, was not recorded in the major historical accounts of the Battle of Stalingrad that would be published in the years and decades following the war. It was, by the standard of the battle's scale, a small event. On any given day in October 1942, dozens of similar engagements, smaller, larger, more spectacular, less instructive, were occurring across the 50-kilometer front line that wound through Stalingrad's shattered geography. The city was consuming men and materiel at a rate that made individual moments almost impossible to distinguish from the collective catastrophe. But the engagement was documented. Kovlyagin's post-action report, filed on October 19th, was reviewed by officers at the 138th Rifle Division level and subsequently passed upward through the chain of command to the headquarters of the 62nd Army, then commanded by Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov. Chuikov, whose personal leadership of the 62nd Army's defense of Stalingrad has been extensively documented, had been systematically collecting and analyzing tactical reports from across the front since September, looking for approaches that worked in the specific conditions of urban combat. He found several things in Kovlyagin's report worth noting. The first was the value of individual observation over immediate reaction. Kovlyagin had been in the sector for more than 3 hours before he fired his first shot. In a conventional tactical framework, that restraint might appear excessive, a failure to engage when engagement was possible. But Kovlyagin's report made clear that premature engagement would almost certainly have resulted in his death, and with it, the loss of the only effective intelligence asset operating in the sector. His patience had been the mission. The second was the identification of the rotation system, the understanding that the German team's effectiveness derived not from the positions they occupied, but from the way in which they moved between them. This insight would later be incorporated in modified form into Soviet counter-sniper training doctrine developed in the winter of 1942-43. The concept of identifying and exploiting transition intervals, the brief windows during which a rotating position is vulnerable, became a standard element of Soviet urban sniper tactics. The third, and perhaps most significant, was the implication of the decoy response. Kovliagin had identified two separate decoy attempts and responded to neither. His reasoning, articulated in his post-action report, was precise. A decoy is a communication. It tells you that the other side is watching and waiting. Responding to it confirms your position. Not responding forces the other side to try something different, and in trying something different, they reveal more than they intended. Silence was a weapon. Chuikov's staff noted all three observations. Whether the direct influence of Kovliagin's report can be traced to specific subsequent Soviet tactical decisions is difficult to establish with certainty. The conditions of the battle in October and November 1942 were too chaotic, and the institutional memory too fragmented to trace clean lines of causation. But the principles it articulated were consistent with the broader evolution of Soviet urban warfare doctrine that emerged from Stalingrad and was codified in the extensive tactical literature produced by the Red Army in 1943 and 1944. The German side of the engagement tells a different story, one of capability without adaptability. The 11-man sniper formation deployed in the northern sector on October 17th represented a genuine tactical innovation. Coordinated overlapping coverage, rotation systems, deliberate rhythm disruption, active decoy deployment. These were sophisticated techniques, and they worked. They worked for 8 hours against an entire Soviet section of the front. They produced significant casualties among exactly the personnel, officers, runners, logistics support, whose loss most severely degraded unit effectiveness. What they could not do was adapt to an opponent who had identified their operating logic and refused to respond to it in the expected ways. The system was optimized for a predictable enemy. When the enemy became unpredictable, when a single rifleman began moving through routes the system had not mapped and engaging during intervals the system had not secured, it could not recalibrate fast enough. The very sophistication of its design became a limitation. A simpler system might have been more flexible. That tension between sophistication and adaptability was not unique to this engagement. It was, in many ways, a microcosm of one of the central strategic problems that the German military confronted throughout the Eastern Front campaign. The design of systems that were highly effective within their operational parameters, but brittle when those parameters changed. In Stalingrad, the parameters changed constantly. The city demanded not just tactical competence, but tactical creativity. The ability to reconfigure rapidly, to learn in real time, to abandon what was not working and try something else. Kovliagin had demonstrated in 6 hours and 31 rounds what that kind of creativity looked like in practice. He had not been faster than the German team. He had not been better equipped. He had been more patient and more willing to be confused. That willingness to sit with incomplete information, to observe without acting, to accept uncertainty as a condition of understanding rather than a problem to be immediately resolved, was what made the difference. In a battlefield environment defined by noise, violence, and the constant pressure to react, the ability to not react, to wait and watch and think, was not passivity. It was discipline of the highest order. Vasily Chuikov, in his memoir of the battle published in 1959, wrote about the qualities that had allowed the 62nd Army to hold Stalingrad against a force that was, by most conventional metrics, superior. He spoke of stubbornness, of adaptability, of the specifically Soviet capacity for endurance. He did not mention Kovliagin by name. He could not have known every man in every sector. But the qualities he described were precisely what the engagement on October 17th had required and demonstrated. And the lesson it carried, that in the most complex and contested environments, understanding is more powerful than reaction, was one that the Battle of Stalingrad would deliver in different forms and at enormous cost, again and again, throughout the 163 days of its duration. He had not been faster than the German team. He had not been better equipped. He had been more patient and more willing to be confused. That willingness to sit with incomplete information, to observe without acting, to accept uncertainty as a condition of understanding rather than a problem to be immediately resolved, was what made the difference. In a battlefield environment defined by noise, violence, and the constant pressure to react, the ability to not react, to wait and watch and think, was not passivity. It was discipline of the highest order. Vasily Chuikov, in his memoir of the battle published in 1959, wrote about the qualities that had allowed the 62nd Army to hold Stalingrad against a force that was, by most conventional metrics, superior. He spoke of stubbornness, of adaptability, of the specifically Soviet capacity for endurance. He did not mention Kulyagin by name. He could not have known every man in every sector. But the qualities he described were precisely what the engagement on October 17th had required and demonstrated. And the lesson it carried, that in the most complex and contested environments, understanding is more powerful than reaction, was one that the Battle of Stalingrad would deliver in different forms and at enormous cost, again and again, throughout the 163 days of its duration.
Senior Sergeant Dmitry Kovlyagin survived the Battle of Stalingrad. His subsequent service record, available in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, shows continued active service with the 344th Rifle Regiment through the winter of 1942-43, including participation in Operation Uranus, the massive Soviet counteroffensive launched on November 19, 1942, that encircled the German Sixth Army and ultimately ended the Battle of Stalingrad in Soviet victory. He was decorated for his actions on October 17th, receiving the Medal for Courage, one of the Soviet Union's most frequently awarded combat decorations, given for specific acts of battlefield bravery. His post-action report was cited in the award documentation, though in the abbreviated and formulaic language typical of Soviet military commendations, which reduced his 8-hour solo engagement against an 11-man German sniper team to a single sentence describing effective independent action in a contested sector. Captain Semyon Voronov, whose command post had been effectively cut off from its forward elements for the duration of the morning's engagement, was killed in action on November 4, 1942, 34 days after the events described in this account. He was 31 years old. The 305th Infantry Division, from which the German sniper team had been drawn, would be trapped in Stalingrad along with the rest of the Sixth Army when Soviet forces completed their encirclement in late November. The division was effectively destroyed in the subsequent fighting. Fewer than 200 of its soldiers survived to be taken prisoner after the German surrender on February 2, 1943. The Barakati gun factory, the ruins in which the engagement on October 17th had been fought, remains in Volgograd today, largely as the battle left it. Sections of the original factory floor are preserved as a memorial site. The collapsed walls, the fractured concrete, the twisted steel, they are still there, weathered by 8 decades of winters, but structurally recognizable as the terrain in which 11 men once tried to stop a war, and 1 man tried to understand them. In the larger history of the Second World War, October 17, 1942, in the northern sector of Stalingrad is a footnote. The battle itself was one of the largest and most decisive in human history, involving millions of men, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and strategic consequences that reshaped the entire European conflict. Against that scale, the events of a single morning in a single factory district, 11 men, 1 man, 31 rounds, appear almost invisible. But that invisibility is itself instructive. The Battle of Stalingrad was not one event. It was hundreds of thousands of small events, each one shaped by the decisions, the patience, the fear, and the intelligence of individual human beings operating under conditions of extreme violence and uncertainty. The grand narrative of the battle, encirclement, counteroffensive, strategic victory, was built from the accumulated weight of those moments. Kovlyagin's engagement was one of them, small in scale, clear in its lesson. In a world defined by overwhelming force and industrial violence, 1 man had demonstrated that the mind was still the most decisive weapon on the battlefield. And in Stalingrad in October 1942, that was not a small thing.